Shang-Chi arrived in Warhammer 40K universe. The Gretchen were already unconscious when Braca found them. 17 of them, heaped in the corridor like discarded rags, their green skin unmarked by blade or bolt, their little chests rising and falling with the slow rhythm of dreamless sleep. The corridor itself was Deck 14 of what the Orcs called the Everlasting Rock, though no Orc alive had named it that or any other name with intention. Names accreted to things in this place the way rust accreted to iron, inevitably, without ceremony. Deck 14 smelled of fungus mash, hydraulic oil, and the particular ferrous sweetness of blood that had dried on metal centuries ago. The walls were layered, literally layered, hull plate upon hull plate, the compressed architecture of 6 or 7 vessels fused by the slow gravity of the deep void into something that had ceased to be a ship and become instead a place. A territory, a world, for those who knew no other. Braca stood 6 feet and 4 inches of green muscle and bad decisions, and he had lived in this world for all 40 years of his violent existence. He was a captain, which meant he was the largest, loudest, and least dead Orc on the Everlasting Rock, a status he renewed every 3 months on average through the simple mechanism of breaking whoever challenged him across the nearest available surface. His left shoulder guard bore the dents of 14 such challenges. He wore them the way other commanders wore medals. He nudged the nearest Gretchen with one iron-capped boot. The Gretchen wheezed softly and did not wake. Braca looked up. At the far end of the corridor, 40 meters away, in the amber half-dark of the rock's eternal fungal lamp glow, a man stood. A human, unarmored, wearing clothes that would not stop a stern look, let alone a bolter round. His hands were raised, not in surrender, but in the low, open guard of something that had finished one fight and was resting before the next. And around those hands, slow as planets, slow as tides, orbited 10 rings of hammered metal that burned with a light the color of dawn through deep water, gold shot through with something older than gold, older than light, older than the concept of metal being shaped by hands. The rings turned, patient, inevitable. They cast no shadows. The shadows in this corridor fled from them. Braca processed this for a full 3 seconds, which was an eternity of contemplation by his standards. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a predator about to kill something small and helpless. The other smile. The one his boys had learned to fear. The smile that meant he had found something interesting enough to fight personally. "Right," said Braca. "Who taught you to punch, Den?" Shang-Chi exhaled. He had been holding that breath since the portal closed behind him, since the last sight of San Francisco fog had been replaced by this pressing, fungal dark, since he had understood with cold absolute clarity that the 17 creatures who had rushed him on arrival were not demons or spirits or chi cultivators in disguise, but something entirely biological, entirely new, and entirely enraged by his existence. He had subdued them without thinking, muscle memory, his body's gift from a father he had tried to leave behind, carrying him through the first 30 seconds before his mind had caught up. He looked at the Orc captain and made the calculation that his mind now urgently offered. Too large for most throws, armor too irregular for pressure point work, stance suggested no martial discipline, no discipline at all, pure weight, pure aggression, pure forward momentum. Against a human, this would have been solvable. Against a creature built like a landscape, it was a different problem entirely. "I don't want to fight you," Shang-Chi said. Braca pointed at the sleeping Gretchen. "You already did." "They attacked me." "Course they did. They attack everything. That's what they are for." He cracked his knuckles. Each joint was the size of a walnut, iron-capped, scarred. "You dunno where you are, do ya?" "No," Shang-Chi admitted. This was the truth, and he had learned, from both his father and his mother, that the truth was the only blade that cut cleanly. "I came through something, a door. I don't know where it took me." Braca's grin had not moved from his face. It was a permanent feature now, geological. "You're in Dar Rock, and Dar Rock belongs to me." He spread his arms wide, a gesture that encompassed the fused corridors, the layers of compressed history, the fungal dark, the slow turning of the rings. So you belong to me. I don't belong to anyone, Shang-Chi said. And this too was the truth, the deeper truth, the one he had bled for, the one his father's voice, which had been quiet for months, had begun in the last hour to dispute. Braka laughed. It sounded like a gearbox failing at speed. Then he launched himself forward, and for a creature of his mass he moved with a speed that had no right to exist, and Shang-Chi's body was moving before the thought formed because his body had been having this conversation with violence for his entire life, and it had opinions. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds and covered 12 meters of corridor. Braka swung. Shang-Chi was not there. Shang-Chi redirected, and 180 kilograms of Orc Captain did not redirect. It continued. It plowed through the corridor wall with the absolute democracy of mass, showering rust and old hull plate fragments. Braka extracted himself from the wall, spitting ferrocrete dust, and looked at his arm where Shang-Chi's redirect had landed. There was a bruise forming. Braka stared at the bruise with something approaching religious wonder. "You hit," he said. "You actually hit me." "I deflected you into a wall," Shang-Chi said. The rings had brightened. He had not asked them to. "Same thing," said Braka, and charged again. This was the truth that Shang-Chi had not yet learned, could not yet learn, because it was a truth native to this galaxy, and unknown in the one he had departed. With orcs, fighting was not a transaction with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was a state of being, a relationship. The exchange of blows was not combat, it was conversation, and Braka Joule had just said hello in the only language he used for people he considered worth knowing. Shang-Chi spent the next 7 minutes in the most physically demanding conversation of his life, and the rings burned brighter with every exchange, and somewhere in the deepest fused chambers of the everlasting rock, something that had been sleeping for 60 million years felt that burning and began, with geological patience, to stir. The second exchange broke a load-bearing strut and sent both combatants through a floor grate into Deck 15, which was distinguished from Deck 14 primarily by the presence of more Gretchen, all of whom scattered with admirable speed and excellent instincts for continued existence. Shang-Chi landed in a roll, came up clean, took stock. His ribs on the left side had taken a glancing blow from Braka's backhand, not broken, probably. His left ear was ringing. The rings were pulling at him now, not against his will but with his will, amplifying it, and this was the thing he had to be careful about, the thing Xu Wenwu's voice in his skull kept noting with quiet satisfaction. "They want to fight. They always want to fight. You always want to fight. You simply have not admitted it." He did not give the thought purchase. He tucked it away, as he had learned to tuck away unwelcome truths, and focused on Braka, who was pulling himself out of the floor grate with the expression of someone having an exceptionally good morning. "You're enjoying this," said Braka. It was not an accusation. It was an observation of kinship. "I'm surviving this," Shang-Chi said. "Dat too." Braka brushed ferrocrete from his shoulder guard. The dents there, Shang-Chi noted, were all on the same side. He had been studying the captain's movement, the unconscious favoring of the right, the slight extension of the left knee in his charges. His body was already learning the grammar of this new kind of violence, even if his philosophy had not yet translated it. "You any good with dose ring things?" Shang-Chi looked at his hands. The rings pulsed once, like a slow heartbeat. "Getting better at understanding them," he said, "every day." Braka nodded slowly. It was the nod of a craftsman appraising another craftsman's work. "Right," he said. "You ain't dead." "I ain't dead. We fight again later. For now, you're my lucky charm." "I'm not a charm," Shang-Chi said. "You knocked out 17 Gretchen with your bare hands, and you're still standing after I hit you 4 times. In this place, that's what we call lucky." Braka turned and began walking back through the breach in the wall toward Deck 14, with the absolute authority of a man who had never encountered a door he was willing to use properly. "Come on, Den. I'll show you da rock." It was not a request. It was not a threat. It was simply the natural continuation of things, and Shang-Chi, who had no map, no allies, no knowledge of where he was, or how far he was from anywhere, followed. Because following was the only option, and because his mother had taught him that the best intelligence came from listening to people who were sure of their ground. And Bracajul was the most certain creature he had ever encountered. There was not a doubt in all that green mass. Not a shadow of self-interrogation. Not a molecule of the paralysis that came from knowing too much about your own worst possibilities. Shang-Chi envied it, briefly, before burying that envy beside the other things he was not yet ready to examine. The everlasting rock was ancient in ways that human language struggled to hold. It had begun, Shang-Chi understood from the hours he spent in Bracca's grudging, profane, surprisingly detailed company, as a warship of some human empire that no longer existed, the name long corroded away from its hull plates. Over centuries, decades, ages, the span meant nothing in the deep void. Other vessels had accreted to it. A Tau transport, its sept markings still faintly visible under layers of orc graffiti. 3 vessels of human origin but incompatible manufacture, suggesting they came from different eras of the same civilization's history. The bones of something enormous and ribbed that Bracca called the old dead thing, don't go near it, and that Shang-Chi recognized as organic, as biological, as the skeletal remnant of a living vessel that had been alive in a way that nothing in his former galaxy had ever been alive. And beneath all of it, deeper than Deck 15, deeper than the Gretchen levels, deeper than the chambers where Bracca's boys played their brutal games of hierarchy and survival, pressed down by the weight of everything above, like a secret crushed under stone, something that was not organic, not human, not orc. Something that had been there before all of them, something that the accumulated mass of the hulk had compressed into dormancy, the way deep geological pressure turns coal into diamond, dormant, waiting, patient with a patience that made the word patient seem inadequate. The rings knew it was there. They had known since the moment Shang-Chi arrived. He was 3 days on the rock, by the reckoning of an internal clock he maintained by discipline and habit, when the Vermilion Compact appeared. He did not know it appeared. He was on Deck 12, which was the level Bracca had designated as Shang-Chi's territory, a decision that the captain had announced to his entire warband with the casual authority of a man redistributing a resource, and which had involved one orc, called Gritclaw, deciding that Shang-Chi was, in fact, not permitted to have territory, and attempting to communicate this view with a wrench the size of a grown man's torso. The wrench was now in 3 pieces. Gritclaw had a new opinion about territory distribution, and held it with great conviction from a position on the floor. The other orcs on Deck 12 had watched and reached their own conclusions, and Shang-Chi had gone back to sitting cross-legged in the corner he was learning to think of as something other than a trap, and meditating on the quiet of deep space, which turned out to be remarkably available to him despite everything, because space was genuinely quiet once you got past the layer of violence. He was in that quiet when the rings shifted, all 10 of them, a slow quarter turn, like compass needles realigning, not toward the hulk's depths, where the sleeping thing breathed its 60-million-year breath, toward the hull, toward something outside. Shang-Chi opened his eyes. 2 decks up, Bracca was already bellowing. The Vermilion Compact was a vessel of measured extravagance, a ship that communicated wealth without communicating taste, which was entirely intentional because taste implied preference, and preference implied vulnerability, and Captain Commodore Oren Stelvus had survived 43 years in the Coronis expanse by refusing to be vulnerable to anything, including good aesthetics. The hull was deep red with gold filigree, the filigree decorative but not idle, in the way that a knife carried as jewelry was still a knife. Her guns were excellent. Her crew were survivors, every one of them, survivors of things that did not usually leave survivors, and they wore that history the way Bracca wore his dented shoulder guard. Stelvus himself was a man of middle years and extraordinary stillness, which was the kind of stillness that came not from inner peace, but from having removed all extraneous motion from himself over decades of practice, keeping only what was useful and discarding the rest. He stood at his auger station and looked at the space hulk on his main viewer with the expression of a man pricing a house he intended to buy below market value. His auger chief, A woman named Dravith, who had augmetic eyes that processed in 17 wavelengths simultaneously, ran her hands over her instruments. Auger returns are confused, sir. Multiple alloy signatures from multiple periods. Standard Hulk composition. However, she paused. She had learned over 12 years of service that Stelvus rewarded the clean presentation of anomalies and punished the burying of them. There are life signs, human, singular, and green skin, multiple, as expected, but the human reads irregular. The biosignature is contaminated with something the machine spirit is flagging as Xenos in origin but cannot categorize. Xenos artifact, said Stelvus. Not a question. Most likely, sir. Stelvus looked at the Hulk for another 4 seconds. Then he looked at his warrant of trade, which hung framed above the station, its wax seal old enough to have been pressed by a hand now centuries dead. The warrant gave him the right to trade, to explore, to negotiate on behalf of the Imperium of mankind in places where the Imperium's regular instruments could not or would not reach. It also gave him a certain flexibility in the definition of these activities, which was, practically speaking, the entire value of the thing. Prepare a boarding party, he said. Full void suits, 2 squads of house guard. Tell Mr. Cork to bring his melter in case we need to discuss salvage rights with the locals. He paused. And somebody go wake the Kroot tracker. I want to know what I'm walking into before I walk into it. The boarding party docked at a secondary airlock on the rock's starboard flank, which the Orcs had sealed with a welded blast door that Kolk removed with professional efficiency. They came in with the practiced formation of people who had boarded hostile vessels before and intended to still be alive at the conclusion. They moved through 3 decks before they met the first Orc, and the first Orc was Bracca, who was waiting for them in the broadest corridor on deck 12, flanked by 40 of his boys in varying states of armament, and who held before him, not roughly, not as a prisoner, but in the manner of a showman presenting an attraction, Shang-Chi. Stelvus took in the scene with his stillness. He took in the Orcs, the corridor, the armament differential, the general atmosphere of barely managed enthusiasm. He took in Shang-Chi. He took in the rings. The rings were burning low, a steady gold, like embers that had not been given permission to flare. Shang-Chi stood in front of Bracca without touching him, and with a gap between them that suggested Bracca was presenting him rather than restraining him, which Stelvus filed under interesting. Well, said Stelvus, good morning. It's morning somewhere, Shang-Chi said. He was looking at the house guard, at the void suits, at the framing of the weapons, reading the room. He was very good at reading rooms. This room said, power differential that everyone in it knows is temporary, a negotiation about to begin in which nobody has clearly identified what currency applies. Captain Commodore Orin Stelvus, Stelvus said, not extending a hand because he was wearing gauntlets and the gesture would have been absurd, of the Vermilion Compact. And you are? Shang-Chi. Stelvus's extraordinary stillness absorbed this without reaction. You're human, he said. Yes. You're wearing rings of non-human manufacture that are giving my augur chief considerable professional anxiety. They're mine, Shang-Chi said. He's my lucky charm, Bracca said, with the emphasis of a man revising a property claim. Fascinating, said Stelvus, and meant it in precisely the way a man means it when he is already deciding what something is worth. Perhaps, Mr. Shang-Chi, we might find somewhere slightly less populated by armed greenskins to have a conversation. I suspect we have a great deal to discuss. What followed was 3 hours in a cleared chamber on deck 12, a space that had once been a mess hall or something functionally similar, its tables long since repurposed or destroyed, its walls carrying Orc glyphs over older human script, over older machine language, over older symbols that neither the Orcs nor the humans could read. Stelvus sat across from Shang-Chi with a portable recaf unit, producing the only civilized smell in a 5-deck radius. His Kroot tracker crouched in the corner, tasting the air. His house guard stood at intervals that were professional and subtle. Bracca sat on a table he was slowly destroying with unconscious fidgeting and listened with the focused attention of someone who had found a new thing and was not ready to stop examining it. Stelvus explained the galaxy. He was, as Shang-Chi would later understand, uniquely suited to this explanation, having encountered more of the galaxy's variety than most servants of the Imperium had any right to survive. He explained it in the way of a man explaining a market, which was his native metaphor, his deepest epistemology. The Imperium of mankind, 1 trillion souls under the governance of a being that had not spoken in 10,000 years, maintained by a church that had made the absence of his voice into the loudest possible theological statement, defended by soldiers who fought and died in numbers that made the word numbers feel insulting. The alien threats, categorized, named, assigned threat designations by a bureaucracy that required the categorization of threats before it could respond to them, meaning that the responses were always institutional, always procedural, occasionally decades behind the actual problem. "And where am I?" Shang-Chi asked. He had been asking this of the rock for 3 days, and the rock had answered with fungal corridors and the smell of blood. He asked it now of Stelvas and received a real answer. The Coronis expanse, beyond the formal borders of the Imperium. Out here, the warrant governs, mine, in this instance. Which means the rules are as flexible as I find it useful for them to be. He poured recaf into a cup he had brought himself, because he was not drinking anything the rock offered, not even theoretically. "Which brings me to the matter of your rings. They're not for sale," Shang-Chi said. "Everything is accessible," Stelvus said gently. "Whether it is then for sale is a separate question. They're mine. They're part of me. They're not a commodity." Brocca was nodding. "He definitely thinks they're his," the captain offered, as objective witness testimony. Stelvus looked at the rings with the 17-wavelength gaze of a man who had learned to look at things his augur chief could not. The rings looked back. They did not pulse, did not flare, but there was about them a quality of attention that made Stelvus feel, briefly, as though he was being assessed in return. He set that feeling aside with the practiced efficiency of a man who had felt things he could not afford to act on for the entirety of his adult life. "I'll be honest with you," he said, which was what Stelvus said when he intended to be selectively honest. "Your rings are generating an energy signature my instruments cannot identify. That, in the Coronis expanse, means one of 3 things. It means they are archaeotech, predating current imperial manufacture. It means they are Xenos, in origin of a type my instruments have not catalogued. Or it means they are warp-touched, which my instruments are very much trying to determine, and which would change our conversation considerably. The warp is..." Shang-Chi paused, searching for the right translation. He had been doing this for 3 days. The language mapped imperfectly. The dimension of psychic energy, the space between spaces. Crudely stated, yes. The rings are not warp-touched. The energy they carry is different, older. Stelvus absorbed this. His Kroot tracker made a sound that was not language, and Stelvus turned to it. The Kroot said 4 words in its own tongue, and Stelvas's expression shifted, a small shift, a reorganization of something internal. "He says," Stelvas translated, "that you smell like before," his word. He cannot explain it further. Shang-Chi did not know what before meant to a Kroot. He did not ask. He was filing things, categorizing them, the way his mother had taught him when she was alive, and the world was a place with dragons in it, and those dragons turned out to be real, and that had been his first lesson in the instability of what he thought he knew. He was on his 4th lesson now, 5th, losing count, and the rings were still turning, and beneath the rock, deeper than Deck 15, deeper than the organic skeleton, the old sleeping thing was stirring with greater urgency. The tremor came during the negotiation. It was not violent, not structural, but it was undeniable, a deep resonance transmitted through the hull, through the floor, into the bones of everyone in the chamber. Stelvas braced his recaf. Bracca looked down at the floor with suspicion, which was unusual because Bracca generally directed his suspicion horizontally. "Da rock don't shake," said Bracca. "It just did," said Stelvas. Shang-Chi's rings blazed. Not gradually, not as a warning. All 10, simultaneously, to full brightness, and the shadows in the chamber did not flee from them so much as simply cease to exist, because the light they shed had the quality of certainty. Shang-Chi stood, and the rings pulled at him, directional, insistent, like a compass finding magnetic north, and the direction was down. "There's something below us," he said. "There is always something below," said Stelvis carefully. "Hulks are layered by definition." "Something alive," said Shang-Chi, "or something that was alive and has decided to be alive again." The silence that followed was the silence of people who knew exactly what that could mean in the Coronis expanse, and did not want to be the first to say it. Braca broke it, as Braca broke most things. "Right," he said, "we're going down." The descent into the rock's lower strata was a descent through time itself, compressed and inverted, the most recent accumulations at the top and the oldest at the bottom, and the oldest was very old. Stelvis went, because he could not afford not to. Whatever was waking below was a threat to his boarding party and to the compact waiting in space outside, and ignorance of threats was a luxury that the expanse taxed fatally. Braca went, because something interesting was happening, and interesting things were the only category of event he treated with full investment. Shang-Chi went because the rings would have taken him regardless, and he preferred to move toward things on his own terms rather than be carried by them, which had been, in retrospect, the central thesis of the last 18 months of his life. The transition from orc-occupied levels to the deeper strata happened at Deck 23, where the fungal lamps ended and the dark became total, and then the dark ended and a different kind of light began, cold, blue-white, geometric. It came from the walls themselves, from panels that had no switch, no mechanism visible to human technology, no mark of organic manufacture. The architecture below Deck 23 was not the layered, accreted chaos of the hulk above. It was precise. It was regular. Was the architecture of a culture that had decided on its geometry in the depths of prehistory and had not revised the decision since, because what is eternal does not revise. The corridors here were clean, not cleaned. Simply clean, with the natural sterility of materials that shed contamination rather than accumulating it. The glyphs on the walls were not orc, they were not imperial, they were not any variant of Xenos script that Stelvis's 30 years of unsanctioned xenological curiosity equipped him to read. But Shang-Chi, looking at them with his rings bright at his sides and his chi sense extended as far as it had ever reached, felt something in him respond to them, not recognition, not understanding, something that lived below both, a resonance, like hearing a voice speaking in a language you do not know, but identifying it as human anyway by rhythm alone. "These are old," he said. "Older than old," said Stelvis, who was photographing everything with a lens implanted above his right eye and trying to maintain his professional composure in the face of an absolute geological anomaly. "Older than the Imperium. Potentially older than my species. Older than yours too," said a voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, from the walls themselves, from the geometric precision, from the cold light that had no source. It was not a loud voice. It did not need to be. It was the voice of something that had spent 60 million years being patient, and had therefore entirely dispensed with the urgency that made other voices loud. "Interesting," Stelvis said, and his hand was on his pistol without him having decided to put it there. She emerged from the far end of the corridor as though she had always been standing there, and they had simply lacked the resolution to see her. 7 feet of living metal, chrome silver where silver had never been polished, carrying a cold radiance that was its own light source. Her face was architectural, carved from material that had started as flesh and been translated, over processes that would take a metallurgical text to describe, into something that remembered the shape of flesh without retaining any of its vulnerability. Her eyes were the blue of absolute cold, the blue at the bottom of a star. She wore no armor because she was her armor. She carried no weapon because she was a weapon. On her left hand, extended in front of her, as a scholar might extend a pointing finger toward a text worth examining, were 4 fingers, and on each finger a ring. Not his rings, her rings. Different in design, similar in language. Old in a way that made his rings seem recent. Shang-Chi looked at his own hands and then at hers, and the rings on both sets of hands brightened, responding to each other across the distance between them, and the light they shared was the same light, the same underlying frequency, the same ancient note of power. "A wielder," said Seteka the Unburdened, overlord of the Nephrek dynasty, sovereign of a tomb fleet that had slept through the entirety of human history and was now, ring by ring, system by system, waking. A genuine wielder. Her voice carried no emotion in the way that absolute certainty carries no hesitation. "I had not thought there were any left." The Acanthi dispersed their instruments so widely at the end. She studied Shang-Chi with her cold blue regard, and in that regard there was something that functioned like wonder, because after 60 million years, even Necrons retained the capacity for something that functioned like wonder when the world provided sufficient cause. "You are human. They gave this to a human." "My father took it," Shang-Chi said, "before me." "Took," she repeated, as though tasting the concept. "The Acanthi instruments cannot be taken. They can only be carried by the willing. Willingness can be deceived, but it cannot be forced." She was still examining him, walking slowly around him in a circle that the rings tracked, all 20 of them between her hands and his, tracking each other. "Your father was willing. That means something. That means something I would very much like to understand." Brucker had been quiet since Seteka appeared, which was unprecedented. He was staring at her with the concentration of a predator triangulating something it was not certain it could fight, which was the most sophisticated form of restraint Brucker possessed. "Metal lady," he said finally, "you gonna cause a problem or not? 'Cause I got a schedule." Seteka looked at Brucker. The look lasted exactly 2 seconds, which was the look she gave to things she classified as irrelevant to the specific problem in front of her. Brucker, to his credit, did not look away. He had never looked away from anything and was not about to reconsider that policy in the lower decks of his own rock. "The green-skin plague," she said, to no one in particular. "Even here, even sleeping for 60 million years, I wake to find them here." She returned her attention to Shang-Chi. "I need to explain something to you. Given what you carry, it is a courtesy I am prepared to extend." "You could just talk to all of us," Shang-Chi said. "I could. I am choosing to address you because you are the only person in this corridor who is carrying something I recognize, something that matters to the problem I am about to describe, and something that I require." The last word fell without menace. It was simply the word that was accurate, and accuracy was what she spoke. The Acanthi instruments respond to intent. They read the carrier's nature. They amplify what the carrier already is. Over time, they also feed on the ambient energy of their environment. She stopped walking. She was directly in front of him now. This environment is not kind to amplification. The rings had been brightening steadily since she began speaking, not at her command, not at Shang-Chi's decision. They were brightening because she was right, because the explanation was the truth, and the truth aligned with what they were already doing, what they had been doing since he arrived, feeding, not maliciously, not with intent, but the way roots feed, seeking what the soil offers, without caring that the soil in question is a wound. The Coronis expanse was saturated with psychic anguish. 10,000 years of war and death and despair had soaked the void so thoroughly that the ambient concentration was measurable to instruments that measured the immeasurable. The rings were not warp-touched, but they were resonant, and resonant instruments, placed in rich media, grow louder. Shang-Chi knew this. He had known it since the second day. He had not wanted to examine it because examining it required listening to the voice that had been growing louder alongside the rings, the voice that spoke in Mandarin, that spoke in the measured cadence of a man who had lived 2,000 years and spent most of those years refusing to acknowledge the cost of power held without restraint. His father, Xu Wenwu, not his ghost, not a haunting, something older than either. The pattern the rings remembered, pressed into them by a man's 70 years of carrying them, imprinted not in the metal, but in whatever the metal used instead of memory. The rings were feeding, and the rings remembered who they had belonged to, and they were inviting him to remember too. I know, Shang-Chi said. I've been aware of it. Awareness is not control, Seteka said. No, he agreed. It isn't. Stelvus had been listening to this exchange with the full application of a mind that had survived 30 years in the expanse by correctly categorizing threats before they became acute. He classified what he was hearing and arrived at a conclusion he did not like and which he was therefore going to act on before the window closed. I wonder, he said, in the voice he used for negotiations where he held fewer cards than he wanted, if we might step back from the immediate metaphysical crisis and discuss what everyone actually wants from this situation. He spread his hands. The gesture was practiced and communicated reasonableness while actually communicating calculation. You, Overlord, want something from Mr. Shang-Chi's rings. Braca wants to keep fighting Mr. Shang-Chi because he is, apparently, entertaining. I want salvage rights to this hulk, which under warrant of trade I am entitled to claim, and which represents a considerable commercial opportunity independent of any Necron military assets that may be waking below. He looked at each of them in turn, ending on Shang-Chi. And you want to understand where you are and how to get home. I suspect I can help with that more immediately than any other person in this corridor, and in return, I simply ask for a reasonable understanding about the rings. Reasonable, Shang-Chi said. Contextually defined, Stelvus said. He wants to sell them, Braca said, helpfully. The rings are not objects that can be transferred by commercial transaction, Seteka said, with the tone of someone correcting a category error rather than objecting to a moral one. They are bound to the carrier's living will. Severing that bond requires either the carrier's death or the carrier's willing release. I am not interested in either. I am interested in something more specific. She looked at Shang-Chi, and her blue eyes held, for the first time, something that was not wonder and not assessment, but a very old version of urgency. My tomb fleet is waking, not merely this vault, all of them. The deep pulse your instruments carried down through the hull triggered a revival cascade. I cannot now halt without using a specific instrument. That instrument was lost 60 million years ago. The energy signature I am tracking suggests it was distributed among tools that were given to mortal carriers. She looked at the rings. I need to understand what happened to it. I need the ring's memory. The rings are mine, Shang-Chi said, again. And this time the word mine carried more weight than the first time, because he was saying it to something that predated his species and had a claim that was at least as old as his father's. They carry what they carry, Seteka said. I am not asking to take them. I am asking you to let me read them. And in return, Stelvus prompted, because Stelvus could not participate in a negotiation without defining the terms, even if the terms were between people who were technically not his parties to negotiate between. In return, Seteka said, I tell you what the instruments are doing to the carrier, what they will continue to do in this environment, and how to stop it. Her blue gaze fixed on Shang-Chi, because if you do not stop it, what your rings are feeding on will eventually become what your rings are feeding back to you, and you will not be the man you are now, you will be the man your father was at his worst. And in this galaxy, a man with that power and that rage and that willingness would be, she paused, searching for the right word, finding it, useful to forces I prefer not to empower. The silence that followed was the most complex silence that corridor had contained in 60 million years. It held Shang-Chi's face, still and careful. It held Braca's unusual quietude, the captain chewing on something that was either food or a thought, impossible to determine. It held Stelvus's calculations, clicking through variables with the efficiency of a counting house engine. It held the ring's light, steady as a held breath. Show me, Shang-Chi said. Show me what you mean. What followed was not a mind meld or a psychic vision or the mystical transfer of knowledge through theatrical methods. It was more like tuning. Seteka extended her ringed hand, and Shang-Chi extended his, and the rings between them, her 4 and his 10, found each other's frequencies the way two tuning forks placed near each other begin to sound, and in that resonance there was information, not language, not images, something below language, below image, the skeleton of what the instruments were built to communicate. He felt the Akanthi. Not as people, the word was insufficient, but as presences that had built these instruments to carry something that pure biological bodies could not safely hold, and had distributed them among the mortal races at the end of something he had no referent for except the feeling of it, a catastrophe so total that the response was to give away everything valuable before the wave hit. He felt the ring's nature, not weapons, not power sources, not artifacts, keys. Stelvas's augur chief had called them Xenos artifacts, and she was not wrong, but she was not precise. They were keys, and what they opened was not a door but a calibration, a tuning of the carrier to something vast and old and deliberately distributed, a frequency that the galaxy was built to generate and that these instruments were built to read. He felt what the rings were feeding on, the anguish, the accumulated psychic weight of 10,000 years of imperial brutality and alien predation, and the constant grinding attrition of a civilization that had decided to survive at the cost of everything that survival was supposed to protect. The rings were drinking it, not maliciously, the way instruments drink the frequencies they are built to detect. But the frequency they were detecting here was wrong. It was wrong in the precise way that his father's application of the rings had been wrong, and the drinking of it was telling them something, or rather telling him something, about what power felt like when it fed on pain, when it stopped being a tool and started being a hunger. He pulled back, before the resonance told him more than he could carry. "I see it," he said. His voice was level, his hands were not shaking. He was concentrating on them not shaking, because this was not the moment for trembling. "I understand what you're saying." "Good," said Sateka. "I'm not going to let it happen," he said. "Intentions are not mechanisms," she said. "I can give you a mechanism, a discipline specific to what the instruments require, in environments saturated with psychic resonance. It will cost you." "Everything costs something," Shang-Chi said. "Pragmatic," said Stelvas, approvingly, from the corner where he had been very quietly photographing everything with his eye lens. The cost was this. Sateka's discipline required Shang-Chi to reduce the ring's ambient draw, to quiet them, which meant quieting the amplification, which meant operating at diminished capacity. Not zero, not weakness, but a ceiling. A chosen ceiling, as opposed to the ceiling the rings would eventually find for themselves in a much less convenient location. He accepted this with the equanimity of a man who had made peace with limits by recognizing that his father's tragedy had been the rejection of them. The rings dimmed, not to nothing, to embers rather than fire. Xu Wenwu's voice in his skull quieted with them. Shang-Chi breathed. The waking cascade below still progressed. Sateka told him this without apology. The revival she could not halt had not been halted. The information the resonance had transmitted to the deeper vaults before she emerged had already done its work. Somewhere below them, below the cold, clean corridors of the Nephrek vault, below the organic bones of the dead Leviathan, below the geological patience of 6 compressed vessels, machines were warming, code was executing, stasis fields were dissolving at cellular level. An army that had outlasted 6 galactic civilizations was opening its eyes. "How many?" Stelvas asked, and for the first time in the conversation his voice had lost the quality of negotiation. It held something simpler. It held survival arithmetic. "Enough," said Sateka, "that you should decide very quickly what you are willing to do." Then Braca laughed, and it sounded like 30 bad things happening simultaneously to machinery, and it echoed through the cold corridors and went down into the depths, and probably did not help with the waking in any way. "Right," said Braca, "now we're having a fight." What rose from the deeper vaults was not yet the full host. The revival cascade had begun but had not completed. What came up through the floor panels, through the geometric corridors, through the cold light that shifted from blue to green as the waking systems warmed, were the advanced elements. Canoptech constructs, mechanical caretakers of an unimaginable dynasty, built to maintain and protect the sleeping lords. They moved with the articulated precision of machines that had been maintained by their own self-repair systems across the whole span of human history. They were not alive, they were not dead, They were a third thing, a thing that the biological mind struggled to categorize, and the attempt to categorize them was, Shang-Chi learned in the first 30 seconds, a tactical mistake. The first construct reached him before he had fully processed its form, a segmented silver thing with limbs that moved in more directions than limbs had any business moving, its cutting implements carrying the cold green light of the deeper system. He moved. The rings flared once, because he was not yet fully settled in the discipline Sateka had shown him, and under threat, the old habits of amplification surged, and the blast that took the construct in its upper segment was clean and bright, and sent the thing tumbling in two distinct pieces that continued to move independently, and he understood immediately that pieces meant nothing. "They reconstitute," Sateka said, from beside him, and she was doing something to the nearer construct with her own ringed hands, something that used the same frequency as his rings but applied it with a precision that 60 million years of practice granted, and the construct she touched stopped moving, with a finality that his assault had not. Target the control node, the segment with the highest thermal signature. He found the node. He hit it. The construct stopped. 3 more came through the floor. Braca hit the first one with the full mass of his body moving at speed, which was genuinely impressive, and the construct went through a wall and into a secondary corridor, and Braca went through after it with the enthusiasm of a creature who had been waiting for something appropriately sized to hit. The crash and clang from the secondary corridor suggested both parties were fully engaged. Stelvas's house guard engaged the second and third with the disciplined fire of professionals. Hotshot lasguns concentrating on the areas Sateka indicated with precise pointing. They were good, they hit what they aimed at. The constructs weathered this for 8 seconds before the node shots landed and they went down. 5 more came. Then 10. Then the floor panel directly beneath Shang-Chi dissolved. He fell 20 feet into a chamber that the floor above had been covering, a chamber lit by the same cold green that the waking system preferred, and he landed in a roll that brought him upright, with the rings up and the chi sense open, and the world in perfect clarity, the way it went perfectly clear when his body decided that the next 30 seconds were critical. The chamber was circular. Its walls carried writing in the Necron script, dense and deep and old, and the writing glowed as the system warmed. In its center, on a throne that was built from materials his rings recognized, in the bone-deep way of resonant instruments, was a figure still in the last stage of waking, not a construct, a lord. A Necron overlord of the mid-tier hierarchy, entombed here as a garrison command, responsible for the vault's defense. Its eyes opened, green, inevitable. The eyes of a machine that had been waiting to open them for longer than human civilization had existed. Shang-Chi hit it before it finished opening. The rings were not dimmed now. The discipline slipped. In the chamber, falling, alone, with a Necron lord waking, and the full history of the Coronis expanse pressing against his rings like floodwater against glass, the old habits of amplification came back with the full endorsement of his nervous system, and the strike he threw was his father's strike, the strike Xu Wenwu had refined across 2,000 years, carried by the rings at full draw. The blow landed on the Overlord's chest, and the Overlord did not simply fall. The throne behind it cracked. The wall behind the throne buckled. The inscription on the nearest wall went dark where the shockwave touched it, the ancient language of the Nephric dynasty temporarily silenced by an energy it had been built to generate rather than receive. The Overlord lay on the chamber floor, still, not destroyed. Necrons were not destroyed easily, but still. Its green eyes still glowed, but they held, now, the particular quality of attention that came from acute reconsideration of an assumed situation. Shang-Chi stood over it with the rings burning, his father's voice loud, the anguish of this place loud, the feeding loud, and the disciplined Setica had shown him a small flame in a large wind. He breathed. He found the discipline. He pulled the amplification back by its root, one ring at a time, settling them, quieting them, choosing the ceiling again, because the ceiling was the choice that kept him himself. The rings went to embers. His father's voice went to echo. Shang-Chi looked down at the Necron Overlord. "I don't want to destroy your vault," he said. I want to leave. All I want is to go home. The Overlord was quiet for 3 seconds. Then its voice came, and it was cold and layered and deeply alien, but it carried the same quality that Seteka's voice carried, the quality of ancient intelligence engaging with a problem that was genuinely novel. The wielder struck first, it said. Protocol would mandate retaliation. Protocol can be revised, said Shang-Chi. A pause. The green eyes recalibrated. Seteka's dynasty has never revised protocol before. Seteka's dynasty never met me before, Shang-Chi said. Another pause. Longer. The constructs above had gone silent, Seteka's work. Bracca's noise in the secondary corridor had also stopped, which either meant Bracca had won or something had eaten Bracca, and from the sound of things moments later, it was Bracca. The chamber settled into a stillness that was not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of a decision being weighed. Revision acknowledged, the Overlord said, and its eyes dimmed to a steady green that read, in the vocabulary of machines that had replaced all other vocabularies, as neutral. The negotiation that followed was not simple. It was not quick. It was conducted partly in the chamber below, partly back in the cold upper corridor with Seteka present as translating authority, partly in a 3-way conversation that included Stelvus, who inserted himself into every gap in proceedings with the practiced intrepidity of a man who treated opportunity as a material to be shaped by human hands, and partly in a series of ring resonance exchanges between Shang-Chi and Seteka that communicated things no language yet spoken in this galaxy was precise enough to convey. What was agreed, in broad terms, was this. The revival cascade would continue. Seteka could not halt it, and would not if she could, because the waking was what 60 million years had been in service of. But the garrison force of this vault would not mobilize against the surface vessels or the rock's population, for 3 reasons. Seteka's preference for examining the wielder without interruption, the garrison overlord's new classification of Shang-Chi as a category that superseded standard protocol, and Bracca's absolute, unhinged, completely genuine willingness to fight every Necron in the vault personally, which had resulted in one more damaged construct, and the Orc captain gaining a level of respect from the garrison force that the garrison force itself seemed unsure how to categorize. Stelvus would receive documentation from Seteka confirming his salvage claim over the non-Nephrec elements of the Hulk, which was everything above Deck 23, which was most of the mass and most of the commercial value, and which represented the single most valuable salvage document in the Coronis expanse since the consecration conclave of the prior century. He accepted it with his customary stillness and only afterward permitted himself, in the privacy of his own mind, the degree of satisfaction that appropriate. Bracca would keep the rock. The Nephrec vault was beneath the rock rather than part of it, which Bracca accepted as a reasonable jurisdictional delineation once it was explained with props. The vault would not expand into Orc territory. The Orcs would not attempt to loot the vault. These terms were expressed in the most basic possible language for the captain's benefit, and he agreed to them after a negotiation that consisted primarily of him asking whether he could fight the garrison overlord personally, the garrison overlord saying no, and Bracca deciding this was fair because the overlord had shown good sense, and good sense was a quality he respected. And Shang-Chi. I need to go home, he said, when the agreements were settled and the cold corridor was quieter, the waking hum from below lowered to something that registered in the chest rather than the bones. I don't know how I got here, and I don't know how to reverse it. Stelvus looked at him with the expression of a man who has one more card. I may be able to help with that, he said. The instrument that brought you here, the portal, it used a power signature my navigators might be able to triangulate backward. It would not be certain. The expanse is not a place that guarantees certainty, but I can try. What does trying cost? Shang-Chi asked. Stelvus smiled. It was a small smile, controlled, but it reached his eyes. Information, he said. What the rings are, what they do, not the rings themselves. Just the knowledge, documented with my full discretion as to its use. Shang-Chi considered this. He looked at Seteka. "The knowledge is already loose," she said. "I have it. He has guessed most of it. Withholding it from him formally costs you more than providing it." A pause that might have been the Necron equivalent of an expression. The instruments were designed to be known. The Acanthe never intended secrecy. Secrecy was the mortal addition. Shang-Chi nodded. "All right," he said to Stelvas, "but I want to be there when the navigators work. I want to understand what they're doing." "Naturally," said Stelvas. The ascent back through the rock's layers was its own kind of ceremony, the three of them climbing back through compressed history, through orc graffiti, over human script, over machine language, over things older than all of them. Braca leading from the front, because Braca led from the front as a matter of gravitational inevitability, Seteka choosing not to accompany them past the Deck 23 boundary because her interests lay below, and she communicated this without apology, which Shang-Chi found, against all expectation, clarifying. She had no investment in his approval of her methods. She had no performance of benevolence. She wanted what she wanted, and she was honest about wanting it. And in a galaxy where Stelvas's honesty was transactional and Braca's honesty was violent, hers was simply factual, and factual honesty, his mother had told him once, was the rarest kind. On Deck 12, before the boarding party reassembled to return to the Vermilion Compact, Braca stopped Shang-Chi with a hand the size of a serving platter, placed on his shoulder with surprising gentleness. "You're leavin'," said the captain. It was not a question. "If I can," Shang-Chi said. Braca looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment, something moved through his face that was not the fight hunger, and not the grin, and not the captain's authority, but something more fundamental, the expression of a creature that had found, in the midst of a life built entirely around combat and domination, one person whose presence had been something genuinely unfamiliar, and had valued it in the only vocabulary available to him. "You're the best fight I've had in 6 years," said Braca. "I'm going to take that as a compliment," said Shang-Chi. "It's the highest one I got," said Braca, and removed his hand, and turned, and did not watch him go. Because orc captains do not watch things leave, they simply face the next direction, and address whatever is there. Shang-Chi looked at the corridor around him one more time, the fungal lamp glow, the layered walls, the sleeping Gretchen, still sleeping, 3 days later, in their original positions, because nothing on Deck 12 had found sufficient reason to move them. He had been here for 76 hours, by his internal reckoning. He had fought an orc captain, survived a Necron overlord, been assessed by an ancient intelligence as a wielder of something her people had built in the deep prehistory of the galaxy, and been offered for sale twice, once by implication and once fairly explicitly. He had felt his father's nature pressing against the backs of his hands, felt the rings feeding on the vast ambient wound of this place, felt the discipline of the ceiling and the cost of accepting it. He was the same person who had stepped through the portal. He was not entirely sure that was true. The Vermilion Compact received its boarding party with the efficiency of a vessel whose crew understood that efficiency was a survival trait. Stelvas went immediately to his navigator, a woman named Phelan who wore the mutation of her calling openly, the third eye, a dark vertical slit that opened when she concentrated, and laid before her the triangulation problem with full technical briefing. Phelan listened. She had been Stelvas's navigator for 9 years, and had learned to listen to him the way one learns to listen to a river, not for every word, but for the direction of flow. Shang-Chi watched from the side of the chamber, arms at his sides, rings dim and patient. Phelan opened her third eye fully, and the light it shed was warp light, the uneasy luminescence of a mind half in one place and half in another, and she reached into the void outside the ship and found the thread. It was not easy. She told them this without embellishment, in the clipped language of her calling. The signature was old, 76 hours old in void time, which was meaningfully different from real time, and the psychic trace had been partially consumed by the ambient resonance, which was what ambient resonance did to foreign frequencies. But the Acanthe instruments generated a distinctive enough signature that a mind trained in 60 years of warp navigation could follow it backward, could find the wound where it had entered, could find the originating frequency on the other side. Probably was the navigator's most frequently used word. "There," said Phelan. Her voice was distant, as it was when she operated through the third eye. "The originating locus is stable. Whatever opened that door, opened it from a place of significant psychic intensity, and it left an impression. She paused. "I can open it again, from this end, briefly." Shang-Chi looked at Stelvus. Stelvus was looking at him with the expression of a man completing a transaction. "The documentation," Shang-Chi said. "About the rings. I'll give you what I know. It won't be complete. I don't have complete knowledge of them myself, but what I know, I'll share." "That is all I have ever asked for," said Stelvus. It took an hour. Stelvus asked questions with the precision of a man who had learned how to structure interrogation as a form of cartography, mapping the territory of what he did not know by the shape of what he was told. Shang-Chi answered with the care of a man who was being honest about something that had cost him considerably, which was the most he could offer, and more than most people in this galaxy ever received. When it was done, Stelvus sat back. He was looking at something on the middle distance, some internal calculation reaching its conclusion. "Do you know," he said, "what the Inquisition will do when I file this?" "Suppress it," Shang-Chi said. "Probably," said Stelvus. "Or they will spend 40 years arguing about whether it constitutes an Xenos threat, a heretical artifact, or a xenological anomaly of unprecedented significance, and during those 40 years, several very motivated people will attempt to find whoever else is carrying the other instruments." He looked at the rings. "You should know that, before you leave, this galaxy is now aware of you, not officially, not broadly, but aware. I keep excellent records, and I have excellent enemies." "Is that a warning?" Shang-Chi asked. "It is a fact," said Stelvus, delivered with goodwill. Shang-Chi stood. The rings turned at his wrists, slow and steady, embers rather than fire, the ceiling held by discipline, and the discipline held by everything his mother had given him, which was, in the end, considerably more than his father had intended to leave in the inheritance. Phelan opened the door. It was not spectacular. It was a seam in the air, 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, and through it was the gray, familiar weight of San Francisco fog at 4 in the morning, the smell of salt and exhaust and the low, deep groan of the bay, and it was so ordinary, so precisely and crushingly ordinary, that Shang-Chi felt it in his chest like a struck bell. He turned. Stelvus stood at a measured distance, his stillness composed and professional. Behind him, visible through the viewing port, the everlasting rock turned in the distant dark, a cathedral of fused vessels, a world that had eaten 6 other worlds and kept their bones, home to orcs who had never seen daylight, and at least one dynasty that had never needed to. "Thank you," Shang-Chi said. It was directed at Stelvus. It was also directed at the corridor, where Braca stood 2 kilometers away, not watching him go. It was directed at cold blue eyes in a geometric vault and the 4 rings on a hand that had remembered what his rings were for. It was directed at all of it, this galaxy's brutal weight, its unasked questions, its answer to everything his inheritance had raised. "Safe travels, Mr. Shang-Chi," said Stelvus, "though I suspect you will find them difficult." Shang-Chi stepped through. The portal closed. The Vermilion Compact recorded a successful first contact, a salvage claim of extraordinary value, and a xenological anomaly of category undetermined. Stelvus filed the xenological anomaly under a cipher that would take an inquisitor of significant resource 3 years to decode, which was, he felt, the appropriate amount of advance notice. He poured himself a second cup of recaf and looked at the rock until it drifted below the viewing angle, and then he looked at the space where it had been, and he thought about Acanthe instruments and the things they were built to carry, and the fact that they had been given to mortal hands at the end of something so large that the end itself had been lost, and he thought about a man in a corridor full of unconscious Gretchen with rings that burned like slow-burning stars. On the rock, Braca Joule held 3 more challenges before the month was done and broke them all across available surfaces and thought, occasionally, about the fight on Deck 12 and the way the human had moved, the stillness between the hits, the space between one breath and the next that was somehow wider than the corridor it occupied. He never fought anything quite like it again. He was still looking. In the cold vault below Deck 23, Seteka the Unburdened resumed her work, the patient work of waking, system by system, dynasty by dynasty, a civilization returning to a galaxy that had grown busy in its absence. She held in her memory the resonance of 10 Acanthi instruments in the hands of a mortal who had chosen a ceiling over a sky, and she filed it under a category that had been empty in her cultural record for 60 million years. Wielder, willing, constrained by choice. She did not know what to do with this information. She was patient enough to wait until she did. And in the warp, in the howling nowhere that pressed against every corner of the materium with the accumulated suffering of 10,000 years, something noticed the wound where the portal had been, and found, in the residue it left, a frequency it had not tasted before. Clean, old, alien to the warp's own nature, a tool built by things that had made the old ones look young, carried by a man who had rejected his inheritance only to discover that rejection, in a galaxy built entirely on brutal legacy, was the most dangerous kind of power of all. The warp filed this information in the way the warp filed things, not in language, not in memory, but in hunger, in the particular gnawing attention that great powers of darkness gave to things that were not yet their enemies and might become something worse. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, where every soul was an inheritance of blood, and every power was the amplified anguish of something that came before, a door had opened and closed. A man with 10 rings and a chosen ceiling had passed through a galaxy that offered no ceilings, only sky, and the things that lived in the sky with their mouths open. He had held, he had left. What he carried home with him was not what the rings had fed on, not the anguish, not the brutality, not the weight of a civilization that had decided to survive rather than live. What he carried home was the knowledge of what he looked like from the outside, what his father's path looked like from the outside, what a wielder who removed the ceiling looked like in a galaxy that had seen it happen 10,000 times and had the scars to prove it. He had chosen the ceiling. He had chosen it again. And somewhere in the deep dark of the Coronis expanse, a Necron overlord 60 million years old updated a category in a cultural record that had been waiting for the entry. The category was old, its heading translated, approximately, as those who carry the weight and choose the form of it. She added a name. The record was complete.